Okay, so we got our first project, and we're going to do the wax up. The first thing I would do is do a thin layer on the palette. You can do that freehand, or you could do that with a smooth stippled pattern wax. So you can get this from the dispenser, you can get it at the front. If you choose, you can do one thin layer. We're going to put stippling on top. If we don't have that available to us, because that controls the thickness of the palette consistently. That's 0.4 millimeters thick. Our stippling is 0.6, which would total 1 millimeter. But I'm going to freehand melt a thin layer of wax. I probably do this from either bad habit or just more convenience, and then I have control. This is the first thing I'm going to do of my wax up. If you have yours ready, you can do it along. If you've already done this stage, you can continue. If you've done and you want to refine, you can go back. Make sure that you have your bead line completely filled in, and overheat this inlay wax or pattern wax that we're using. I saw some of you lay the blue 20 gauge wax inside the finish line. You can do this, but I think you run the risk that of not sealing it. Just by putting it in the trough of the bead line doesn't mean it's going to fulfill what you need it to. You need to heat it in place. So if you do use that 20 gauge wax along the bead line, heat it up. I'll be a little more cavalier to finish the inside. I've done the bead line all the way around, and I'm going to go slightly beyond the bead line. Go slightly beyond the bead line. I'm going to trim to the line. And naturally, with some experience, you know, if you go beyond a millimeter or half a millimeter, that's enough. If you go beyond that, you're just creating too much extra chromium cobalt to trim. And once I'm finished flowing a thin layer of inlay wax, I can use the alcohol torch to smooth it out. If you notice, on the canines are going to be aprons. I've gone just slightly up the tooth, maybe halfway. Because this apron is going to be tapered at the incisal edge, or at the inferior border of the apron, with 0.6 millimeters stippled wax. My next step would be the mesh retention to put on. Now, I've got to join the mesh retention with the palette. So possibly I want to be symmetrical about that and maybe cut a half a row of these circles. Or even a quarter row, but don't cut the circles flush. With the palette. And again, from the cases we've done before, we know that we always end up overextending this. Keep in mind the neck of the cervical margin of the prosthetic tooth. And I can trim this just to the height of the ridge, slightly beyond. I'll do the other side. Remember that this mesh retention has a smooth surface, which is on the patterned paper. That will be on the intaglio surface of the model, and the textured part of the stipple will be on the surface facing us. Now, after I've put that in place, I'm going to join the two pieces together, again with my spatula and free-flowing wax. Here we go. Naturally, neatness is the key. So the same level of detail that you take into your full gold crowns, I want you to take that level of detail in this wax up, is where we should be going. After your wax up is complete, you could use the microscopes that you have to really fine tune your wax up. The investments that we're using the Bagos Fine. It is just as detailed as your crown and bridge investment. It's just at a higher heat temperature, I think. So, I've sealed these two together, as you can see. They're now one. If I'm concerned about the strength of my palatal strap, I may add a slight thicker layer of reinforcement down the middle from the left side to the right side. And just a little bit more. And then use the alcohol torch maybe to blend all that in. And as well blend in the outside of the mesh to the major connector. If it's a little thick in areas, you can remove it. If you've got a little bit extra sagging wax in between the rugaes, going to reduce the weight of the partial. The next step is the clasp design. I've already ledged for the Acres clasp on 1.6 and 2.7. So I'm going to go ahead, add the reciprocal arm on top of the ledge on the reciprocal side. And whether you use the, let's say, tree variety of clasps or the ones that come on either side, it doesn't matter. Whichever one you feel more comfortable with, or whichever one we have handy. I'm going to use the, let's say, middle part of this tree clasp here, because it's a little bit thicker than the end. And then a little bit of the clasp here has also created the thickness of my guide plane. I'll fill in the rest. And this is a real critical area, is the shoulders of the clasp. So just adjacent to the rest on the buckle and the lingual, I'm going to seal in, as well as underneath the thickness of the guide plane, which will be within the confines of the occlusal table. Don't go beyond the occlusal table for your guide plane. You'll just end up having to trim it. Maybe I'll fill in this other circle here. And then I'll continue on to the 2.7. Now I used my fingernail to shorten that clasp and put it in place. Is really be careful not to nick the profile with your fingernail or spatula, as to maintain the integrity of the profile of wax. In the workplace, I may use an eraser at the end of, I think from ceramics, I have a little pointed eraser that I can use to place it in place, or something blunt. Again, the occlusal rest and the shoulders sealed to the model. It's not necessary to seal the whole clasp arms. You're just going to change the profile of the Acres clasp arms. Keep them as they were off the patterns plates. So 1-3 and 2-3 are vacant because I'm going to put wrought wire clasps. We have a choice. We have stainless steel clasps that we can embed into the acrylic if we wish. We have the Iconium wire, which is here, which is a little more costly, but it'll withstand the heat of the laser welder as well. The stainless steel seems to kind of blow through, depending, we change the heat setting maybe on the laser welder. But that Iconium wire, if I was to embed it in the wax up, I'll show you that now. So the Iconium wire, if you work harden it by bending it back and forth, becomes more brittle. So really you got like one shot at bending it. And the reason why I don't like to put it in the wax up is because the Iconium wire was meant to go with Iconium alloy, which casts at a temperature well below that of what we're doing this high heat investment. And when we put the temperature up that high on the Iconium wire, it becomes dead soft and loses its properties of modulus of elasticity. Although somehow it becomes a latent gene of most dental technicians and dentists. They say, "I'll just put Iconium wire," without understanding the dental materials of this wire. It's not meant to be put in with any chromium cobalt system. It's meant only to go with the Iconium system, which they don't sell anymore. They just sell the wire. Why do they keep selling the wire? Well, because people keep buying it. So why not keep selling it if people buy it? So if I was going to embed it into the wax up, I would make the tail part of my wire, part of the finishing line, as to kind of hide it within my wax up. I'm going to laser weld this wire just inside the finishing line. It's not imperative that you bend the wire now. I was just doing it as an example. You can bend your wire after your framework is done, but it would go in position something like this inside my finishing line. And then I'm going to tack this with a laser welder. So I'll put this clasp aside. I have the Iconium wire here at the front. You can get it in the dispensary. Please be really sparing with it because it's very costly. Like, I think one of these is maybe $20. So be really careful with it. We put in the curriculum because on previous examinations, someone in their wisdom asked the students to bend wrought wire clasps for a casting. I guess they're also checking your orthodontic skills. So I'm going to leave the wires off this wax up. And then I'm going to add them after. And then we will laser weld them on. Some of you last semester, we had a chance to laser weld some clasps that had went by the wayside. So my next step is to put my external finishing line on. There's one side. And I told you last time there's a couple of ways to do this. You can do it after the stippling. I choose to do it before. I think it's a little bit neater. Again, no straight lines in your external finishing line. Try to create some symmetry. Here I'm trying to simulate two bicuspid lingual gingival margins. I got to be careful not to ruin the profile of the 20 gauge wax with my hot spatula. I'm just flowing wax in behind. The biggest mistake I see most people doing in their wax up is they're not using their spatula hot enough. It's all about controlling the wax. I mean, these patterns are made to aid in the speed of our wax up. We could do it without the profiles. The external finishing line comes straight down from the guide plane. So it doesn't come on an angle. It doesn't come more mesial. It doesn't come distal. Straight down and then across. Straight down and then across. I can also go and use a little alcohol torch if I want to kind of smooth it out. Before I add my stippling, reduce some extra thickness if I have some. And then in comes my stippled pattern. And we're going to use here 0.6. Again, if I just put it on here, depending on the depth of the palette, if I do this, I'm going to stretch it. So maybe I can kind of fold it over in the anterior and the posterior to maintain the thickness. Gently, without disturbing the stippling. Here to the model, gently, all the way down. So we got 0.4 smooth, or 0.4 of my own freehand wax, and 0.6. We're at about 1 millimeter thick. Most textbooks say about 1.5 millimeters at the thickest point. And that's where I put that little bar that went across. Maybe that's an extra 0.2. So I'm at a total of 1.2. I'm going to surgerize the stippling wax just beyond the confines of my bead line, just beyond. And you can almost see through here. I've just gone past it. Make sure it's all the way down on the model. Try not to disturb the integrity of the wax design. And then here, I would heat up my surgical blade. And now this is probably the most difficult and challenging for most of us, is to, with a steady hand, carve half of the 20 gauge wax and the stippling wax at the same time, creating my external finishing line. And I'll do the other side. Above the cingulum for my aprons, probably just stippling wax above the height of contour of the lingual of the canines. And then the last step is seal the major connector. I don't want to have any investment creeping underneath the stippled pattern. So heat up your spatula. I've gone beyond the bead line with the stippled pattern, so I'm using the stippled pattern beyond the bead line as my wax. I'm not adding any on my spatula, and I'm sealing it to the model. Top of the apron of 3. And the inferior border of the stippled pattern. Now at this point is where you can go back with your Zale carver, and if you've gone a little bit too long, you want to save time trimming, you can reduce this and neatness of. You can go and shape your rests. Any overextensions of wax, like at my apron, I can carve it straight across. I can straighten out my guide planes. I mean, it's easier to trim them in wax than it is in chrome with discs and high speed and hand pieces and carbides. Last step is to sprue the case. I think on the previous one we took a rectangular sprue wax, which will do the same, and we'll sprue it just inside the finishing line on both sides without ruining the integrity of the finishing line, and 2 sprues just above the height of contour, and we're good to invest it in the same fashion. Add the sprue, be nice and neat, make sure their funnel is no higher than the height of occlusion, seal it to the base, wax it to the ring, invest it, and we're ready to move on.